Another one of them, popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts, no argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about Dark Side of the Ring, which focused on the Sheik at Farhat, and we're going to also talk about his nephew, Terry Bronk Sabu. First, we're going to talk about the Sheik, however, because he was the focus of Dark Side of the Ring, and they did a really good job of telling the story of the Sheik. There's just some details that I want to get into. I read the book by Brian Solomon called Blood and Fire. I suggest if you care about the Sheik at all, if you're into classic wrestling at all, I suggest reread that book. This documentary was based a lot on that book, but it's in a 45-minute format, so there are some things that were actually missing. The cast actually elevated this thing a lot, especially his granddaughters, because they focused a lot on his home life, you know, the man that they knew, not necessarily the character. But of course, the real sympathetic thing for somebody in my age group is Sabu. He actually cries in this episode talking about his uncle, which is, I don't think I've ever seen Sabu cry. So that was very important, you know, and that was, especially this aired the week he passed away, you know, literally a couple of days later. It's very touching, you know, very moving that we got to see that part of him before he left this earth. But let's talk about the original Sheik. Now, they didn't give you a full biography of the Sheik, so I'll give you some of his biography. He was born Edward George Farhat. His parents are from Lebanon, but he was born in Lansing, Michigan. He was born June 9th, 1926. He died January 18th, 2003. Despite being of Arabian background, he was actually a Catholic, and he had grown up Catholic. His parents were Catholic. He was greatly inspired by a movie named Elephant Boy, which came out in 1937. He would have been about 10 or 11 years old. In that movie, there was an Indian Muslim hero by the name of Sabu. Now, clearly, that name Sabu comes into play later. He names his nephew Sabu the Elephant Boy, which is shortened to just Sabu later on when he starts wrestling. But this is kind of where he starts getting the germ of the idea of the character that he wants to play when he's interested in pro wrestling. He worked on an assembly line at age 13, and he continued to work on an assembly line while he was wrestling in his early days. He started wrestling as the Arabian Sheik in 1949. That would become later the Sheik of R.I.P, and that's where he became sort of popular. As the Sheik of R.I.P, he made television in the 1950s, which added some popularity to the character, so much so he was able to challenge for the NWA World Championship against Luthez. He only got, I think, 2 matches against Luthez because Luthez hated working with gimmicks, quote unquote. Guys who were not legitimate shooters, guys who, you know, their matches involved a lot of, you know, weird stuff like disqualifications, and the Sheik was known for getting disqualified, and, you know, he wasn't doing the blood and the fire and all that stuff yet, but he wasn't a proficient wrestler, like actually getting on the mat. He didn't have like an NCAA background or anything like that. And one thing about Luthez is he's very particular. Like, he didn't want to work on the same card if women were booked. He didn't want to work on the same card if midgets were booked. He really only enjoyed or had any interest in wrestling people who had other NCAA or collegiate backgrounds. And so he's kind of a dickhead in modern parlance. That's how we would see him. If it was Hulk Hogan or something like that, people would be like, oh, he's an asshole. But it was Luthez, and it was the 40s and the 50s. People are kind of like, oh, yeah, well, he was very particular about the kinds of people he worked with. And he didn't really like the Sheik, and he was known for threatening the Sheik. And during one of the matches, he actually threatened to break his legs if he did any of his gimmicks in the ring. And because that's what the Sheik does, he did it anyway. And he ended up running away from Luthez, which actually got him more heat, because it was hilarious that he ran, and I think he said he hid underneath a car after he did one of his pre-match gimmicks, and Lou Thesz got really mad at him because he told him no gimmicks. So that was pretty funny. It's a pretty funny passage in the book because they talked about in Dark Side of the Ring that, you know, credibility and keeping kayfabe and stuff like this was extremely important. And the Sheik wanted to keep his character strong. You know, he was a jabroni for parts of his career, and he didn't really, obviously, he didn't like that. And as he became more and more popular, he would refuse to do jobs. And he was probably going to lose to Lou Thesz anyway. I guess he was figuring how he was going to lose was he was just going to get counted out or disqualified or whatever, and not give Lou Thesz the satisfaction of beating him, you know. So he ran away, which is hilarious. But he only had 1 or 2 matches with Lou Thesz, not a lot. He was also one of the first guys to really use like personal managers. Like he had a Princess Salima, who was of course his wife Joyce, who he would abuse, you know, which plays a lot into the Arabic stereotypes, especially Arabic Muslim stereotypes, that they're very abusive towards their wives. That was not mentioned in Dark Side of the Ring, but it is important to note that, you know, he's playing off of a lot of the stereotypes of his own people. And there have been a lot of folks who have been criticized over the years for doing that with their characters, Eddie Guerrero being one of them. You know, they say, oh, he's like a cartoon version of a Mexican, or, you know, Crime Time in the WWE, you know, various ninja or samurai based characters that the Japanese wrestlers take on. They usually get criticized for something like that. I think Saray got criticized for doing, you know, the Sailor Moon type gimmick in NXT, but it worked. At the time, this is what they wanted. They wanted a foreign menace, and everything that was against what was accepted in the 1950s and 60s, the Sheik would do. You know, he had a wife that was covered up. They didn't know it was his wife, but they, you know, she was covered up. He did Muslim prayers. It was all in service of the character, and he never spoke English. So it was all about getting the character credible and keeping the character looking strong. And because he was so protective of the character, he never responded to his actual name. He would only respond to Sheik, which is they went through a great deal of detail talking about in Dark Side of the Ring. And it's very entertaining that he said that they said even the grandchildren called him Sheik. Nobody called him by his actual name because he wouldn't respond. That's just phenomenal dedication to the gimmick. He gets the name Sheik in 1960 when he goes to Capitol Wrestling, which of course by this time is being run by Vincent James McMahon. The Sheik of Araby becomes just the Sheik. And in 1964, the Sheik purchased the Detroit territory from Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett for $50,000. This includes parts of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and even some parts of Canada. To maintain that the Sheik didn't speak English, and that, you know, the Sheik wasn't really, while he was rich and wealthy and all this, they figured he couldn't handle business. So his wife and his father-in-law, Francis Fleischer, actually ran the company on paper, but he of course was the boss. They tell the story that he bought his first mobile TV truck. So he was a guy who would tape his own shows and no longer was paying the TV stations to do so. And the 1960s and 70s and parts of the 80s were huge for the Sheik because he now owned his own territory. And he made himself the top star of the territory, and he would often use what we know now as the WWF philosophy, where you would have one top star and then they would face a parade of different challengers. The difference being, of course, in the WWF, it would be baby faces, but in Big Time, it was heel. He was the heel. So he would bring in Bobo Brazil, more than likely, and a bunch of other people and just work with them. They never win, you know, or they may win once or twice, or they may win by disqualification. But the idea being is that the Sheik doesn't really lose. This would be to the rise and detriment of Big Time Wrestling. And they didn't really talk about this in Dark Side of the Ring, but the event that sort of killed the territory was a match with Andre the Giant, where they brought in Andre the Giant and Sheik didn't lose to Andre. Instead, Sheik threw a fireball. And At that point, it was a disqualification, and people were kind of like, look, enough's enough. Like, this guy's invincible. Nobody's beating him. It's been 20 years or whatever. He loses like one match a year or something like that. And that was it. But throughout the time that big time wrestling existed, it was one of the more popular promotions in the country. It was known as being sort of a hardcore, where there was a lot of blood and guts and fire because the Sheik did. Also, it was sort of a punch kick territory that they call it, which of course also he modeled after Capital Wrestling and the WWF, because it was easier for him to do because he didn't have the collegiate wrestling background. So he would just lean more into the brawling. And it worked. The territory was extremely successful. The Dark Side of the Ring, they talked about how he had these huge mansions built. He had different suits every day. He would have a limo drive him to the arena. He had all these rings. And, if you know anything about Arabs, and here in Michigan, we know a little bit about Arabs. When they get money, boy, they are flashy. Okay, they are very flashy. And he kind of bought into that stereotype, too, that he was sort of this oil-rich sheik. And the territory was so popular that when Dick the Bruiser tried to invade in the 70s, he was just completely wiped out. There were very minor issues in terms of attendance. Of course, attendance started to taper off later. They blamed the Michigan economy and the Dark Side of the Ring, basically that people didn't have disposable income anymore, and that was part of it. There was some big issues with the auto unions and the automotive industry in general in the 80s. So that's when you started seeing things taper off. So it was like a combination of creative issues where the Sheik always either wins or he escapes comeuppance, and then also that the local economy sort of tanked. And that was similar to what happened in Mid-South, the Bill Watts territory, where it was a combination of, what was going on with the local economy and what was going on with the creative, because the Junkyard Dog had left. So there was a lot of stuff going on. And this is what likely killed a lot of territories, is local economies went down. And they blamed Vince McMahon for it. Like, he actually aided in some of this stuff. But a lot of it was the industries needed other industries in order to operate. The people needed jobs. They need jobs to get money, and they need money to give to you. If they don't have money, they can't give it to you. So when the auto industry tanked in Detroit, it definitely served a huge blow to big time wrestling, just like when the oil industry tanked down in Mid-South. So from there, the Sheik is in his 50s or 60s at this point, and he has to find something else to do. Now we're going to back up a little bit because, we just skipped over like 25, 30 years of big time wrestling. So I do want to note that Sheik worked for Vincent James McMahon. Again, he worked for him and actually main evented Madison Square Garden twice with Bruno Sammartino. During his third trip to Madison Square Garden, this time was against Haystacks Calhoun. That's when he got banned for starting a riot. That was in 1969. His two matches were Bruno. His first match was November the 18th, 1968. They drew 12,000 people, and the Sheik lost by disqualification. They had a rematch that drew 10,943. It was a Texas death match, and Bruno actually won that match by submission. So he only main evented Madison Square Garden twice. The Haystacks Calhoun match was not a main event. It was on the undercard, but he smashed some tables or something like that and caused a miniature riot, and allegedly got banned from New York, which only leads to the reputation of the Sheik. Because the reputation of the Sheik is really all he's got left after big time wrestling, tumbles. Now, in Dark Side of the Ring, they did mention this, and I think it's probably worth talking about, was the Sheik voluntarily losing to Bobo Brazil in order to sort of quell the race issues in Detroit. There were obviously very well-known riots in Detroit during the 1960s, specifically in 1967. It was probably the big riot. And Sheik decided in August of that year to drop the title to Bobo Brazil, who is another Michigan native. I don't believe he was born in Michigan, but I believe he lived in the state. And so he was pretty well known. Obviously, he's the biggest black wrestler of the time. And he voluntarily lost the belt to him. Now, when he did win the belt back, I think Cornette said it was 2 weeks later in the documentary. I believe it was 6 weeks later, according to the book. So sometime between 2 and 6 weeks later. Then it actually did not happen at Kobo. He actually won it in Ohio. So in order to sort of protect Bobo from having to lose in Detroit. So where both of them have been pretty popular, because again, Bobo Brazil, even my dad know who Bobo Brazil is. So that should tell you how popular Bobo Brazil is. So my dad hates wrestling. And even he knew who Bobo Brazil was. But the Arabs and the blacks in Detroit live very close together. There's a city by the name of Hamtramck where they pretty much mixed in together. I know people hear a lot about Dearborn, and they think that Dearborn is basically all Arabs. And it's not all Arabs. It's a suburb of Detroit. You know, I think the Arabs are still a minority in the city, but they live fairly close together, you know, and here in this area. So the blacks and the Arabs kind of have a relationship similar to how you would see blacks and Hispanics in California or in Texas or something like that. That's how blacks and Arabs are in Detroit. So this was a pretty good nod by the Sheik to the population that had come to support his program. But it wasn't just a good social thing to do, but it was also good creative, as it gave people hope that the Sheik could be beaten. And those little nuggets right there would actually keep, big time wrestling around for a long time. Because again, when you didn't have that, that's when the show eventually died. They talk about in Dark Side of the Ring that the Sheik would lose the ability to pay talent in the mid 70s. And they tell this story about Bruno Sammartino deciding that he was going to no-show some big time wrestling events in the future. That's pretty bad, man. But it was typical of wrestlers in the territory era. If they weren't going to get paid or if they couldn't get paid, they would just no-show events because they didn't have contracts. Like, they weren't going to sue a guy. There's no contract for you to be here. And this is what Vincent K. McMahon would prey upon later and talk talent into no-showing shows, because what are they going to do? Right? Of course, that's kind of grimy, but the boys were already doing it. They were already no-showing events if they weren't going to get paid, or they were threatening promoters, doing a Bruiser Brody, where they were, threatening to kill promoters or whatever. But just politely not showing up might have been the least of what could have occurred if you don't have any money. So in the 1980s, big time wrestling is essentially dead. And the one thing that the Sheik has left is his reputation and the fact that he had not abused his time in Japan. So he starts going over to Japan for All Japan Pro Wrestling. They are very much into the blood and the fire, and he makes great money there. In Dark Side of the Ring, they talked about how athletically the age issue starts to catch up with him because he can't work. And also, he's not the boss anymore, so now he's got to do what other people are telling him to do. And, it's a completely different ball game at the time. In Dark Side of the Ring, they said that he was having a late life crisis because he was already in his 60s. Now that his career is winding down, it's time to start creating the next generation as a way of making money. And this is where we get Sabu and Rob Van Dam, where they start telling their story. Sabu's mom is the Sheik's sister, one of his sisters. His dad was abusive. And his uncle would beat up his dad. And Sabu would say that he saw his dad hide from the Sheik. And so he was inspired by him and said that his uncle was more like his dad. Sabu told the story of getting shot in the face at 19 years old. And that was sort of the light bulb to get him into wrestling. And he had only trained for about a year. And the Sheik didn't have him do anything but chop wood, washing his car, cleaning his house. Basically treated him like a handmaid. Made sure he wanted to really get into the business. And Sheik made him earn it. He talked about, he refused to copy him, but he did obviously take certain elements from the Sheik, not just the headdress and the style, but If you actually watch old Sheik matches, you can see quite outside of Sabu doing the highly athletic elements, it's pretty much the Sheik. In 1989, a young man by the name of Rob Schamberger finds the Sheik. He had been doing some kickboxing training and was wanting to get into pro wrestling, and he paid $2,000 to go into a half ring and be mostly trained by Terry, who of course will go on to be Sabu. But the Sheik was there and pretty much put the fear of God into him. Rob Van Dam told the story of the Sheik just choking him and making faces. And then after he was pretty much accepted into the family, Rob was trained by the Sheik. At this point, Sabu was going by the name Terry SR, but they say that Terry didn't know what SR stood for. And some people would say it was Sheik's relative. Other people would say it was Sheik's revenge. But that's pretty much how he started his career. And then he was renamed Sabu the Elephant Boy, which of course was shortened to Sabu later on. He became the booking agent for Sabu and Rob Van Dam. Essentially, he would book them out. Sometimes he even traveled with them. He traveled mostly with Sabu when he did take his few dates that he was taking. Again, at this point in time, Sheik is in his 60s. He can't really move or can't really do anything. Sabu was introduced to Philadelphia through Joel Goodhart's Tri-State Wrestling Alliance. This is in September of 1991 when Sabu is brought along with the Sheik. The Sheik is the one who's actually getting booked, and Sabu is kind of an extra. Like, you got to take my nephew if you're going to get me. And so this is where Sabu is first introduced to the Philadelphia area. This would have been in the early 90s. 1991, the Sheik is invited by Atsushi Onita to come to FMW. And they made their debut as a tag team, Sheik and Sabu, in November of 1991, defeating Mark Starr and Horace Boulder. Horace Boulder, of course, is the nephew of Hulk Hogan. Onita is very impressed by Sabu at this point in time, you know, the athleticism, the recklessness. And he, of course, just, hey, as long as Sheik is going to come back, Sabu's can come back too. And they actually wrestled as a tag team again in May of 1992. This was the infamous Ring of Fire match, where it was Atsushi Onita and Tarzan Goto versus the Sheik and Sabu. Sabu tells the story that he didn't know about it being a fire match. Essentially, Sheik had agreed to it, but without telling Sabu what it was going to be. And so he finds out that it's going to be a Ring of Fire match that is inspired by what they had seen in Puerto Rico and what Onita had seen in Puerto Rico. And they decide to do this thing, and you could see it if you ever watched it. It's only like 3 or 4 minutes. It's not very long because the fire consumed the ring fairly quickly. What ended up happening is they tied some towels around the ropes, and then they doused the towels in kerosene and they lit the towels on fire. But the fire got completely out of control. It consumed all the oxygen. They're outside. The ring is consumed with fire. Tarzan Goto and Atsushi Onita escape the ring. Sabu escapes the ring. And they left the Sheik because, again, this man is in his 60s. He ends up getting burned. 20% of his body, third-degree burns. It's awful. Despite the fact that he was burned horrifically and covered in bandages or whatever at the time, the Sheik would actually become the oldest heavyweight champion in wrestling history at 66 years old. In June of 1992, at the Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center, in front of 6,500 fans, he would win FMW's championship. Without knowing that much about FMW, I'm going to assume this is their highest championship that they have in the company. And this is just about 3 weeks after he was burned. So this guy is 66 years old. 20% of his body was burned in a fire that was obviously set up in the ring. And 3 weeks later, he's not only wrestling, he's their champion. He's their top guy. That's absolutely insane. As a sign of respect, the Sheik actually takes his NWA United States title, which was the top championship of big time wrestling. He had been champion for 10 years. He voluntarily dropped it to Atsushi Onita in January 1993 as a sign of respect to Onita. So that was very sweet. And at this point in time, again, this guy he's in his 60s and he's still wrestling in these matches. Also in 1993, Sabu got his tryout with WCW. In the Wrestling Observer newsletter, it was noted that Sabu broke the nose of the jabroni he wrestled in his first match and got a second chance. And despite the fact that the second chance went much better, Harlem Heat was signed over Sabu, and you can believe that Meltzer had a definite problem with Sabu not being signed because he was a favorite in the sheets at the time. So he's very upset that Sabu did not get the job in WCW. But Sabu does, of course, make some appearances in WCW. One of whom is where the Sheik threw a fireball and Sabu broke the Sheik's leg by mistake. This, of course, will be the end of the Sheik's career. At this point, the guy's he's 70, I believe, or 68 or something like that. It's way past time for him to go home. And Sabu has to go forward on his own now. Sabu tells the story in Dark Side of the Ring that he didn't know the Sheik had passed away in 2003 until he was already in the air during a trip to Japan. And that when various wrestlers started saying, hey, sorry to hear about your uncle, he started questioning, like, what the hell? And he said Bill Goldberg came up to him and said, hey, sorry to hear about your uncle. He was like, what the hell? I barely know you. What the hell you care about my uncle for? And then Goldberg told him, like, hey, yeah, he passed. And he found out while he was in Japan, and he stayed in Japan because it's what his uncle would have wanted. It wasn't him to be professional. And this is where Sabu actually cries and says that when he got back, he had missed the funeral. And he says that, the Sheik was everything to him. And he was more than a father. And that was very sweet. It was a very sweet moment from a man who didn't show a lot of a range of emotion anyway. Sabu was not known for fits of laughter or fits of tears. For someone who wasn't emotional, it was certainly a very emotional moment. And they also went over the Sheik being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. So the Dark Side of the Ring was great. It felt like a true biography of the person in question. They talked about the Sheik. They talked about his relationship to Sabu. They talked about his success, his rise, his fall. They obviously skipped over some details, but the details that they skipped over were not all that important. They hit some of the most infamous things that he had done. The Ring of Fire being the most infamous match that Sheik had participated in. So this was, the style that he popularized and all this was tremendous. And it was very important at this time, at least, to get that story out there. And it was based very heavily on Brian Solomon's book, which does a great job of telling the story of the Sheik. It's a really good book. I suggest it for anybody who's a fan of wrestling history. This video will continue, however, because now we're going to talk about the career of Sabu. And we already talked about the Sheik. So Sabu, 1993, essentially he's on his own now. He gets a WWF tryout against Scott Taylor, and then another one against Owen Hart. He's offered the job of being the Sultan. They're going to create a gimmick that, if you look at it, it was Sabu. It ended up going to Rikishi, but when you look at the Sultan gimmick, it was going to be Sabu. They gave him a Hannibal Lecter mask so he wouldn't talk, and there's the parachute pants, which of course Sabu was wearing, the shoes with the toe pointed up, which of course comes from the Iron Sheik and some of the other sort of Arabic characters that have been throughout history who have worn those kinds of boots. So when you look at that, you can tell that, yes, the idea of this was supposed to be for Sabu. Sabu shot the deal down and gave a couple of different reasons over the years. One is that the Iron Sheik was going to be the manager of the Sultan, and the Iron Sheik is hated by Sheik and Sabu because they feel like he stole the character, even though the character is not the same, and the Sheik wasn't even the first Sheik. There were other Sheiks before Ed Farhat, right? So, but the Iron Sheik is the most popular Sheik. He was a WWF champion. He was the one who was, in cartoons. He was the one that, when people say the Sheik or Sheiky baby, they're talking about the Iron Sheik. And they felt disrespected by that. So that was one of the reasons why Sabu refused to do the Sultan, is that he refused to have the Iron Sheik be his manager because he thought it would be an offense to his uncle. The second is, despite the fact that he was going to make a ton of money in the WWF, he wanted to continue working in Japan, and WWF was like, no. Vince McMahon's like, no way. Why would you want to continue working in Japan? What's wrong with you? So Sabu continues his work in ECW and FMW. ECW, he actually debuted in October against the Tasmaniac, of course, would go on to be Taz. Meltzer referred to Sabu as the 90s Superfly Snuka, which is very high praise, because Superfly Snuka was fantastic when he was in his prime. And comparing Sabu to Snuka was tremendous, and it's quite apt when you take into account the physicality of the characters, the psychology of the characters, two wild men, high flyers, reckless abandon. The both were very popular too. So I get that. That was very cool. He spent the 90s feuding with Terry Funk, Cactus Jack, etc. in ECW and around the independents. Meltzer referred to him as the best performer in the country, even better than Ric Flair and Bret the Hitman Hart, which of course is extremely high praise. He's saying this guy is 1993, 1994 is a better wrestler than Ric Flair and Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, I guess you could say he didn't say wrestler, he said performer, and that's still very high praise to put him in the same conversation with those guys. Sabu broke his neck in November of 1994 from a botched backdrop in a match against Chris Benoit. This is, of course, what get Chris Benoit the name the Crippler. He would get the label homicidal, suicidal, genocidal in December of 1994 from Public Enemy, who basically just said it in a promo, and it stuck. In April of 1995, Sabu was fired from ECW for no-showing a pay-per-view event. He was booked to make $3,500 in Japan over making only $500 in ECW, so he chose to go to Japan. Paul Heyman and Todd Gordon both claimed they were not informed. Sabu claimed that he did tell them that he was going to do the Japanese show over the ECW show, but there was steadily brewing heat between the parties anyway, due to Sabu feeling like the rest of the ECW roster were ripping him off. Everybody's doing tables now, everybody's doing barbed wire now, everybody's doing fire now. It's making what Sabu does less special. So there was already heat there, and then he no-showed this event, and it became an even bigger problem. And as ECW decides they're going to absolutely destroy Sabu, which Paul Heyman does in public, when he basically runs Sabu down and turns the audience against him, Sabu decides to turn a favor. He goes to work for Dennis Coralluzzo, who runs the NWA. Now, the NWA at this point is obviously dead. Dennis Coralluzzo had been double-crossed by Heyman and Gordon in the infamous Shane Douglas segment that happened in 1994, I believe, or 1993 or something like that. At this point, it's almost 95. And Dennis Coralluzzo hates ECW. Now, initially, they were working partners because Todd Gordon and Dennis Coralluzzo, they were friends, and at least initially. And then as ECW got more popular, than what he was doing, because Dennis Coralluzzo was the booker in New Jersey, I want to say. And as ECW got more popular, Dennis Coralluzzo completely didn't like the style. The blood, the fire, the thumbtacks, all that stuff. He didn't like any of that. So Todd Gordon would say that Dennis Coralluzzo was trying to sabotage ECW. He would say that, he was calling the fire departments and he was trying to get our shows shut down. He was running to the sheets, disrespecting us, yada, yada, yada. And so Sabu going to work for Dennis Coralluzzo was basically a slap in the face to Todd Gordon and Paul Heyman. Also during this time, NWA Sabu is launched. Now, NWA Sabu is a National Wrestling Alliance. It's actually more of a colloquial name because Sabu was supposed to be the top star for a local NWA territory. It didn't run very long, but the Sheik was involved with this and trying to make Sabu who he was. He had big time wrestling. So Sabu was going to have this NWA territory in Michigan and Ohio built around him. But the fact that Dennis Coralluzzo, who was going to be involved with this, was double-crossed by Heyman and Todd Gordon, it squashed the promotion. So a few of the shows happened. I think they had like 6 shows. But the promotion never really got off the ground because Dennis Coralluzzo didn't want anything to do with Heyman and Todd Gordon anymore. And this was before Sabu fell out with them. So it would be, these guys are all in one big mix at this point, right? And the Sheik is still around, clearly, because when Sabu goes to Japan, he jumped ship from FMW to New Japan in December of 94. The Sheik actually went with him. And in May of 1995, which was FMW's biggest show ever, that was the largest audience of people who had ever seen the Sheik perform. 58,000 people. And Sheik wrestled and had a heart attack after that. 48,000 people watched Sabu win the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title in the Fukuoka Dome. So they were beloved in Japan. In June of 95, Sabu starts having some conversations with Paul Heyman about returning to ECW. During this time, he, of course, goes to work for WCW. He had no formal contract at that point in time. He also gets more tryouts with the WWE, and that still didn't work out. And he decides he's going to not work for Dennis Coralluzzo anymore because Dennis Coralluzzo, who's not a fan of the hardcore wrestling, he's trying to limit Sabu too much. So Sabu's kind of frustrated that Coralluzzo won't let him do him and be who he is. So he decides to break out and he's going to leave the NWA territory. And so he returns to ECW. And everything from there is pretty cut and dry. Sabu works in ECW. He does the Invasion in 1997, where he jumped off the R, even though he fell. They're not sure if he fell or whether he jumped. Sabu was known for botching things on purpose to add a level of realism to it. He worked in TNA when ECW closed. He bounced around in TNA doing matches here and there. He did matches on the independents. He won the NWA world title in 2000, which was his second world title. Of course, he had won the world title in ECW as well. And he got the big run in the WWF in 2005-06, where they relaunched ECW. Obviously, he was a focal point of that. I was thrilled when Sabu was brought into the WWF. I thought, hey, they're bringing back ECW. This is the one guy you need. This is the face, the mascot, the heartbeat of ECW. More so, Tommy Dreamer is the guy that, WWE would tell you is probably the most important guys. No, Sabu is the most important guy when it comes to ECW. And when they got him locked in, I was like, okay, this thing has a chance. The ECW Sabu was the WWE ECW Sabu. Wasn't nearly as hardcore, obviously, but he still felt mostly like Sabu. He had the match with John Cena at, I believe it was Unforgiven. I believe it was. And let me tell you, this has nothing to do with facts and figures or history or anything like this. Sabu versus John Cena touched me all over the place. All right. First, I was extremely excited because John Cena being taken out of his element by Sabu is the kind of stuff that I wanted to see. It reminded me so much of when I saw Mankind versus Shawn Michaels at the Mind Games in Philly, 1996, right? I remember watching that pay-per-view thinking, holy shit. And then when I got tapes and DVDs and stuff, I saw Sting wrestle Mick Foley and Beach Blast, and I think some other events where Sting would be pushed to the absolute limit by Cactus Jack. And I said, this is exactly what John Cena needs. He needs Sabu to go in there, make him bleed, take him to the limit. And then Cena won by submission. I almost died. I swear, I think my soul left my body for a second. I looked around. I was by myself at the time. I think my brothers were there, but I felt like I was by myself. Sabu, the guy who had wrestled the Born to Be Wired match, who had torn his flesh open with barbed wire and taped it closed. This guy who I've seen get blown up. This guy who had a broken jaw and taped his jaw closed, lost to John Cena by submission. I wanted to quit watching wrestling at that point. It was absurd. It was absolutely absurd. And I was thinking to myself, even at that time, I was like 22 or 23, being very, very smarky. They didn't even have the good sense to make Foley tap out. Like, Foley never submitted in WWE to my knowledge. I don't think he ever lost a match by submission. Because his entire gimmick is that he absorbs punishment. The only time he really did lose was he put the mandible claw on himself in a match with Ken Shamrock, right? Which was actually very fun. You should go watch that match, by the way. But Sabu submitting to John Cena, I'm like, his entire gimmick is that he's Sabu. And you can't kill this guy and you can barely hurt him. He toughs through everything. And he can't survive an STF. I don't care what anybody says about Triple H and Sting. This is worse. When Cena submitted Sabu, I was like, everything is off the table. When I saw Sting lose to Triple H, everybody's like, oh my God, this is the worst thing. No. Did you forget that Sabu submitted to John Cena? Did you forget that? Because it happened. All right. We're not talking about a pin here. A pin, anybody can pin somebody. Who cares? He lost by submission to John Cena. It is offensive to me as somebody who watched Born to Be Wired, as somebody who was at that point in time familiar with Sabu being set on fire, with broken his jaw, breaking his neck, taping himself closed, super glue, the whole 9 yards. It was offensive that John Cena would beat Sabu by submission. All right. It was absurd. Still, Sabu was kind of the guy for a long time that they would bring in to put over other people. I remember when TNA brought him in to put over Samoa Joe. I really liked that cage match that they had. I really like his barbed wire match with Abyss too. I'm not really that big on death matches, but Sabu had an era of danger to his work that very few people have, especially very few people that I've had the privilege of watching. There's certain guys, certain performers that when they're in the match, everything is heightened and it becomes tense and intense. And Sabu has such intensity, even in matches where he's not doing, fire, thumbtacks, barbed wire, or whatever. He still had intensity in his matches. He was very entertaining without talking. Physically, he was charismatic. He was a phenomenal professional wrestler. A darling of the tape traders, the magazine collectors. And, he was going through a lot in the last several years of his life. In 2021, he said his wife died, Melissa Coates. I don't know if they actually got married, but he says wife, so I'm going to go with wife. And he was suffering from that. And of course, in 2025, April, he ends up having his final match against Joey Janela at Joey Janela's spring break. This match, of course, had tons of controversy, not only because Sabu had another barbed wire match at 60, which saw him fall face first through barbed wire and get knocked unconscious, but also behind the scenes with him not being able to perform and not being medically cleared to perform at some point, and then magically he was able to go. So there's a lot there, but Sabu is such a special performer, and it's sad that a lot of people will not or did not take that much attention to it until he was near the end of his life. And also, with the death of Sabu and the death of the Sheik, you get the death of danger in wrestling to a degree. There's not a lot of guys that when you announce them, you say the other guy's fucked. Sabu is one of those guys that you have a match with Sabu, you're fucked. No matter how tough you are, he's going to put you through something. You're going to take a knee to the chin off that triple jump moonsault or something like that. You know, you take a chair to the face. You know, you might bleed. You might get stabbed with something. Those guys are not really around in wrestling anymore. Not at a high level anyway. There's probably a bunch of fat guys who hit each other with, you know, light tubes or something like that. But guys who are acrobatic, who looked dangerous, who lived the gimmick, whose persona matched what you saw in the ring, there's none better than the Sheik and Sabu. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
No one does it better.